Vladimir Ilyich Lenin. The Right of Nations to Self-Determination. 6. Norway's secession from Sweden. Rosa Luxemburg cites precisely this example, and discusses it as follows. The latest event in the history of federative relations, the secession of Norway from Sweden, which at the time was hastily seized upon by the social-patriotic Polish press, see the Krakow episode, see footnote 2, as a gratifying sign of the strength and progressive nature of the tendency towards state secession, at once provided striking proof that federalism and its concomitant separation are in no way an expression of progress or democracy. After the so-called Norwegian Revolution, which meant that the Swedish king was deposed and compelled to leave Norway, the Norwegians coolly proceeded to choose another king, formally rejecting, by a national referendum, the proposal to establish a republic. That which superficial admirers of all national movements and of all semblance of independence proclaimed to be a revolution was simply a manifestation of peasant and petty bourgeois particularism, the desire to have a king of their own for their money instead of one imposed upon them by the Swedish aristocracy, and was, consequently, a movement that had absolutely nothing in common with revolution. At the same time, the dissolution of the union between Sweden and Norway showed once more to what extent, in this case also, the federation which had existed until then was only an expression of purely dynastic interests and, therefore, merely a form of monarchism and reaction. Glad. That is literally all that Rosa Luxemburg has to say on this score. Admittedly, it would have been difficult for her to have revealed the hopelessness of her position more saliently than she has done in this particular instance. The question was, and is, do the Social Democrats in a mixed national state need a program that recognizes the right to self-determination or secession? What does the example of Norway, cited by Rosa Luxemburg, tell us on this point? Our author twists and turns, exercises her wit and rails at NORWAY'S, but she does not answer the question. Rosa Luxemburg speaks about everything under the sun so as to avoid saying a single word about the actual point at issue. Undoubtedly, in wishing to have a king of their own for their money, and in rejecting, in a national referendum, the proposal to establish a republic, the Norwegian petty bourgeoisie displayed exceedingly bad Philistine qualities. Undoubtedly, NORWAY'S displayed equally bad and equally Philistine qualities in failing to notice this. But what has all this to do with the case? The question under discussion was the right of nations to self-determination and the attitude to be adopted by the socialist proletariat towards this right. Why, then, does not Rosa Luxemburg answer this question instead of beating about the bush? To a mouse there is no stronger beast than the cat, it is said. To Rosa Luxemburg there is evidently no stronger beast than the Fracii. Fracii is the popular term for the Polish Socialist Party, its so-called revolutionary section, and the Krakow newspaper NORWAY'S shares the views of that section. Rosa Luxemburg is so blinded by her fight against the nationalism of that section that she loses sight of everything except NORWAY'S. If NORWAY'S says yes, Rosa Luxemburg considers it her sacred duty to say an immediate no, without stopping to think that by so doing she does not reveal independence of NORWAY'S, but, on the contrary, her ludicrous dependence on the Fracii and her inability to see things from a viewpoint any deeper and broader than that of the Krakow anthill. NORWAY'S, of course, is a wretched and by no means Marxist organ, but that should not prevent us from properly analyzing the example of Norway, once we have chosen it. To analyze this example in Marxist fashion, we must deal, not with the vices of the awfully terrible Fracii, but, first, with the concrete historical features of the secession of Norway from Sweden, and secondly, with the tasks which confronted the proletariat of both countries in connection with this secession. The geographic, economic and languages ties between Norway and Sweden are as intimate as those between the Great Russians and many other Slav nations. But the union between Norway and Sweden was not a voluntary one, and in dragging in the question of federation Rosa Luxemburg was talking at random, simply because she did not know what to say. Norway was ceded to Sweden by the monarchs during the Napoleonic Wars, against the will of the Norwegians, and the Swedes had to bring troops into Norway to subdue her. Despite the very extensive autonomy which Norway enjoyed, she had her own parliament, etc. There was constant friction between Norway and Sweden for many decades after the Union, and the Norwegians strove hard to throw off the yoke of the Swedish aristocracy. At last, in August 1905, they succeeded. The Norwegian parliament resolved that the Swedish king was no longer king of Norway, and in the referendum held later among the Norwegian people, the overwhelming majority, about 200,000 as against a few hundred, voted for complete separation from Sweden. After a short period of indecision, the Swedes resigned themselves to the fact of secession. This example shows us on what grounds cases of the secession of nations are practicable, and actually occur, under modern economic and political relationships, and the form secession sometimes assumes under conditions of political freedom and democracy. No social democrat will deny, unless he would profess indifference to questions of political freedom and democracy, in which case he is naturally no longer a social democrat, that this example virtually proves that it is the bounden duty of class-conscious workers to conduct systematic propaganda and prepare the ground for the settlement of conflicts that may arise over the secession of nations, not in the Russian way, but only in the way they were settled in 1905 between Norway and Sweden. This is exactly what is meant by the demand in the program for the recognition of the right of nations to self-determination. But Rosa Luxemburg tried to get around a fact that was repugnant to her theory by violently attacking the Philistinism of the Norwegian Philistines and the Krakow episode, for she understood perfectly well that this historical fact completely refutes her phrases about the right of nations to self-determination being a utopia, or like the right to eat off gold plates, etc. Such phrases only express a smug and opportunist belief in the immutability of the present alignment of forces among the nationalities of Eastern Europe. To proceed. In the question of the self-determination of nations, as in every other question, we are interested, first and foremost, in the self-determination of the proletariat within a given nation. Rosa Luxemburg modestly evaded this question too, for she realized that an analysis of it on the basis of the example of Norway, which she herself had chosen, would be disastrous to her theory. What position did the Norwegian and Swedish proletariat take, and indeed had to take, in the conflict over secession? After Norway seceded, the class-conscious workers of Norway would naturally have voted for a republic, see footnote 1, and if some socialists voted otherwise it only goes to show how much dense, Philistine opportunism there sometimes is in the European socialist movement. There can be no two opinions about that, and we mention the point only because Rosa Luxemburg is trying to obscure the issue by speaking off the mark. We do not know whether the Norwegian socialist program made it obligatory for Norwegian social democrats to hold particular views on the question of secession. We will assume that it did not, and that the Norwegian socialists left it an open question as to what extent the autonomy of Norway gave sufficient scope to wage the class struggle freely, or to what extent the eternal friction and conflicts with the Swedish aristocracy hindered freedom of economic life. But it cannot be disputed that the Norwegian proletariat had to oppose this aristocracy and support Norwegian peasant democracy, with all its Philistine limitations. And the Swedish proletariat? It is common knowledge that the Swedish landed proprietors, abetted by the Swedish clergy, advocated war against Norway. Inasmuch as Norway was much weaker than Sweden, had already experienced a Swedish invasion, and the Swedish aristocracy carries enormous weight in its own country, this advocacy of war presented a grave danger. We may be sure that the Swedish Kokoschkin spent much time and energy in trying to corrupt the minds of the Swedish people by appeals to handle the elastic formulas of political self-determination of nations carefully, by painting horrific pictures of the danger of the disintegration of the state and by assuring them that people's freedom was compatible with the traditions of the Swedish aristocracy. There cannot be the slightest doubt that the Swedish Social Democrats would have betrayed the cause of socialism and democracy if they had not fought with all their might to combat both the landlord and the Kokoschkin ideology and policy, and if they had failed to demand, not only equality of nations in general, to which the Kokashkins also subscribe, but also the right of nations to self-determination, Norway's freedom to secede. The close alliance between the Norwegian and Swedish workers, their complete fraternal class solidarity, gained from the Swedish workers' recognition of the right of the Norwegians to secede. This convinced the Norwegian workers that the Swedish workers were not infected with Swedish nationalism, and that they placed fraternity with the Norwegian proletarians above the privileges of the Swedish bourgeoisie and aristocracy. The dissolution of the ties imposed upon Norway by the monarchs of Europe and the Swedish aristocracy strengthened the ties between the Norwegian and Swedish workers. The Swedish workers have proved that in spite of all the vicissitudes of bourgeois policy, bourgeois relations may quite possibly bring about a repetition of the forcible subjection of the Norwegians to the Swedes. They will be able to preserve and defend the complete equality and class solidarity of the workers of both nations in the struggle against both the Swedish and the Norwegian bourgeoisie. Incidentally, this reveals how groundless and even frivolous are the attempts sometimes made by the Frasi to use our disagreements with Rosa Luxemburg against Polish social democracy. The Frasi are not a proletarian or a socialist party, but a petty bourgeois nationalist party, something like Polish social revolutionaries. There never has been, nor could there be, any question of unity between the Russian Social Democrats and this party. On the other hand, no Russian Social Democrat has ever repented of the close relations and unity that have been established with the Polish Social Democrats. The Polish Social Democrats have rendered a great historical service by creating the first really Marxist, proletarian party in Poland, a country imbued with nationalist aspirations and passions. Yet the service the Polish Social Democrats have rendered is a great one, not because Rosa Luxemburg has talked a lot of nonsense about Section 9 of the Russian Marxists' program, but despite that sad circumstance. The question of the right to self-determination is of course not so important to the Polish Social Democrats as it is to the Russian. It is quite understandable that in their zeal, sometimes a little excessive, perhaps, to combat the nationalistically blinded petty bourgeoisie or Poland, the Polish Social Democrats should overdo things. No Russian Marxist has ever thought of blaming the Polish Social Democrats for being opposed to the secession of Poland. These Social Democrats err only when, like Rosa Luxemburg, they try to deny the necessity of including the recognition of the right to self-determination in the program of the Russian Marxists. Virtually, this is like attempting to apply relationships, understandable by Krakow standards, to all the peoples and nations inhabiting Russia, including the Great Russians. It means being Polish nationalists the wrong way round, not Russian, not International Social Democrats. For International Social Democracy stands for the recognition of the right of nations to self-determination. This is what we shall now proceed to discuss. Notes. 1. Since the majority of the Norwegian nation was in favor of a monarchy while the proletariat wanted a republic, the Norwegian proletariat was, generally speaking, confronted with the alternative, either revolution, if conditions were ripe for it, or submission to the will of the majority and prolonged propaganda and agitation work. Lenin's note. 2. NOWZD, forward, central organ of the Social Democratic Party of Galicia and Silesia, published in Krakow beginning with 1892. The newspaper, which was a vehicle of petty bourgeois nationalist ideas, was described by Lenin as a very bad, and not at all Marxist organ.